Hello, brothers and sisters of the Fellowship, of the Brighamites, of the Strangites, anybody who's interested in Strang, who's following my series or Zoom calls about James Strang. James Strang is the prophet successor to Joseph Smith. And so on Saturdays, we're doing a call on Zoom that is anything about Strang, whether it's the Book of the Law, his prophecies, the history, anything about him, his character. I love James Strang. And so I love talking about him. He's such an inspiration to me. And today I'm talking to a brother named Matthew who is, he has recently, somehow or another, because he was reading anti-Strang material, very much like my own story once upon a time, and he got a spiritual testimony, a witness, to know that James was a prophet, notwithstanding that, you know, what he's reading is not written by people favorable to James, and the lies and the, I mean, it's overwhelming how much distortion can come against these prophets, and they never let up, ever. and they won't admit they were wrong. When you corner them and show them that their facts are wrong, they'll just say, well, we don't know, or I think you're being naive. They'll walk away, even defeated. They won't accept it. So anyway, I just found out today a brand new book just a few hours ago, yet another anti-Strangite Mormon book has been published by a would-be pseudo historian, totally distorting the facts. And so I recalled FAIRLDS. I read their write-up on Strang, which is not correct, right? But I went to it and I sent it to him because he's like, well, I'm talking to some of my LDS friends, and they're saying this and they're saying that, and so I went to it. So I'm going to read this now, and I'm going to give a response because it needs to be responded to. Unfortunately, FAIRLDS doesn't have a comment section where you can call them on this stuff. So it's, you just got to publish it on your own, and people are going to find it and believe it's gospel. But here's the one thing that's good, because I sent them the link and I said, you know, if these things that this historian who's trying to make money selling this this thing like an attention grabber, if it's true, the Utah church and the investigators for FAIR, they're going to have investigated this, and they're going to post about it. They're going to be talking about it. So, and they don't. I mean, they mostly stick to facts when they're talking about things like the letter of appointment. It gets really, when they get to the witnesses and the some of the other things, they start to distort things. So I'm going to address that. So here they said, and this is from the Utah LDS Church, talking about Strang, who's Brigham Young's competitor at the time, and so they're naturally wanting to present things. They don't want to seem like they're lying. They want some plausible deniability, but you can see how there's subtle things in the language. So pay close attention. You got to be really shrewd, but you got to pay attention to the language. So here he says, well, who was James Strang? James Strang, and this is FAIRMORMON.org, answers/book_of_Mormon/witnesses/Strangite_parallels. Okay, follow that. I'll put a link in the description. James Jesse Strang was a Latter-day Saint leader in Nauvoo who established a breakaway Mormon sect after the murder of Joseph Smith. I mean, it's not a bad thing to say. Established a breakaway Mormon sect is false. Brigham Young had the breakaway Mormon sect. James had the continuation of Joseph's church. And we'll get into that at some point, but it has to do with the structure of the church. Brigham Young pretty much admitted it when he let James have the Kirtland Temple. He withdrew his own lawsuit that he was trying to sue to get possession of the Kirtland Temple because he knew that James's case was ironclad. And his best bet was to run away and not get bested in a court of law debating on record where everybody could see that James was the true successor. And nobody's going to let go of the temple easily, trust me. So, James Strang was a Latter-day Saint leader in Nauvoo. Well, he wasn't in Nauvoo. He showed up in February of 1844, was baptized, was ordained. He met Joseph and Hiram. There were prophecies made about him, but and he told Joseph, I'm going to go. You know, I think Joseph was looking for where are we going to move the saints. We need to go somewhere. Open up a new sect because we're getting chased out of Nauvoo. And so, so he proposes Wisconsin. He goes home. He writes up a whole thing about it, and he mails it to Joseph, and Joseph writes a response. Okay? And that precedes this whole thing, because to Joseph's surprise, he receives a revelation, and he even writes in the letter, I was going to send you an unfavorable response. He's a little dramatic, saying, well, you must have been deceived by a spirit. But he says, oh, the littleness of man in his best earthly estate. Not so came the voice of the Almighty. So he receives a spontaneous revelation. This letter becomes becomes the letter of appointment. It gets mailed from Nauvoo, Illinois, 9 days before Joseph died. It contains, in writing, a prophecy of Joseph's death. So it's really important. Now, Joseph, we've all heard the stories about Joseph prophesying his own death. I go as a lamb to the slaughter, and I'm as peaceful as a summer morn, or something to that effect. And, but all of those things come to us through, it's almost hearsay, right? I mean, I believe it, right? I believe he said these things, but non-Mormons would hear that and think, well, people said that he said it. Did he really say it? This document was mailed, and it's postmarked, and it was really slow delivery at the time. We have documented that Joseph did actually prophesy his own death in no uncertain terms 9 days before he died. And it also this letter prophesies all the things that James Strang would do. So it's rich in prophecy that is provably, demonstrably, that came true. So it's a very important letter for multiple reasons. So James does not create a breakaway sect. He is the successor to Joseph Smith. He continues the same church. And the courts of law have heard evidence on this and declared that Brigham Young is the one who started his own church. So he is the schism. It's not about the size of your church. Your schism can get pretty big, and we haven't reached the end of time, and I'm predicting that the ranks in that church are going to get smaller. So the final count's not in, and if you're just counting numbers, there's nothing in Scripture that would justify doing that. So after Joseph Smith, so he's not in Nauvoo, and he's not starting a breakaway sect. After Joseph Smith was murdered, there were several claimants to his role as leader and prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're hyphenating it, but it wasn't hyphenated at the time. See succession. One of these was James Strang. One of them was Brigham Young. A recent convert to the church, and that's very important. Several prominent families, including many members of Joseph Smith's family, accepted Strang's claims, and they were based on a letter which Strang said Joseph had written appointing him as the president of the church, should Joseph Smith be killed. Well, It didn't say. Well, it does say if something befall me, you know, the flock will find rest with you, or something to that effect. Should Joseph be killed? Okay, along with the letter, Strang claimed that an angel had ordained him to the office of prophet immediately following Joseph's death. All true. Strang's group is formally called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, no hyphen with different capitalization, but Strang's church and his followers are commonly called Strangites. Okay? And the Utah Church are commonly called Brighamites. They've distanced themselves from Brigham Young's doctrine, so I don't like to call them that anymore. So I call them the Utah Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or ULDS. Strang and his associates settled for several years on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, where he was pronounced king. Strang, who was an almost pathological overachiever. Yeah, you know, this is the whole thing. You can make anything bad, right? You know, I don't think he was an overachiever. He achieved the things that he set out to do. He went and he did exactly what Joseph Smith did in every regard. How is somebody who believes in Joseph Smith going to accuse him or try to paint in a bad light the things, you know? Joseph Smith wasn't he? He was the mayor of Nauvoo, I think. You know, he was running for president. You know, James Strang ran and was elected into the House of Representatives twice. You know, everything he set out to do, he succeeded in doing. You know, he published the scripture, he had the witnesses, he opened 2 stakes of Zion and led the church for 12 years. You know, he did it. You know, it's not an overachievement if it's within your ability to make happen. So, so he was a visionary, and it's a nice thing to say about a prophet. Was also a lawyer, a land developer, a news correspondent for the New York Tribune, and a scientist for the Smithsonian Institute. I mean, all really impressive things. Strang was killed in 1856 by some of his disaffected followers at Beaver Island, and you know, like Joseph Smith, who was killed by disaffected followers, also in cahoots with anti-Mormons who never were followers. This is true of both of them. And also with a conspiracy involving officials from the government for both of them. Identical. You know, it was planned by the captain of the federal steamer ship that was pulled into the harbor, and he went and summoned Strang, and when Strang was walking up the gangway, that's when these people, and it was well known these guys were gunning for James, they came and killed him, and then they ran aboard the boat, and the captain refused to turn him off. He was offering protection to him, and he intentionally drove him across the harbor to this town that was complete enemies with James, hated his guts, had sworn to get him, had tried to get him and kill him so many times, you know, and mostly because he was a good legislator who was not allowing them to continue their piracy and criminal activities and you know, bootlegging liquor to the Native Americans and taking advantage of them. So Strang was killed. Okay. Following his death, his movement started to disband. Today, there are less than 500 Strangite members living mostly in Michigan and Wisconsin. Well, that's outdated, right? It might have been true a decade ago, but there's thousands now on multiple continents, and it's growing. There's people leaving the Utah church in Africa and other places, and I'm one of them. I read about Strang, I converted, and I left the Utah church to become a Strangite. So they're out there. Now, Strang's letter of appointment. Strang's claimed letter of appointment. See, you know, if they're going to let you decide this for yourself, just say what it is. But they're going to take every opportunity they can to cast some doubt. The letter of appointment, the only professional firm that's job is to identify and match up authorship to letters that's ever reviewed this, to my knowledge, said that this had all the markings of an authentic letter. So there's that. But they do mention that in the article, but it's in a footnote. Strang's claimed letter of appointment has received a lot of attention from scholars for obvious reasons. There are a few things in dispute about the document. Brighamites have disputed everything about the document, and most of the things that they offered were completely false. There were lies about the document, but the document stands today, and it's in the Yale University Library. There are a few things in dispute. The first is that the wording of the document is somewhat ambiguous, and that's a distortion, and it's a matter of opinion. I don't think it's ambiguous at all. It is very clear. I think it's just as ambiguous as it needs to, because Christ, you know, he says, let the one who has eyes to see, see. If you have ears to hear, hear. But the things that he says in there, you have to be completely blind to not see, and that's fine. There are a lot of blind people in the world. So the document seems to only appoint Strang as the president of the newly created Voorhees stake in Wisconsin. The newly created wasn't created. It wasn't created. That was what they were writing about. That's what Joseph was writing about. He created it by saying, yes, we're going to do it. And, you know, is he just, you know, opening of a stake requires being a president anyway. But anyway, he talks about Revelation in there. He talks about the flock finding rest with James. It's very clear that this is a letter of appointment. And is Joseph a prophet or is he not? Strang's son, Charles Strang, was among those who believed this. Maybe, maybe not, but it's irrelevant. One thing is that, you know, the thing about these prophets is that so much hatred and negativity gets stirred up by people that are you know, just bent on mudslinging and tarnishing them, that people like their innocent children or family members who, you know, they don't have a testimony, but they're really embarrassed by it, and they keep getting heaped with shame by people who won't let up. You know, they'll come up with anything. I'm sure that Charles Strang would rather believe that James misinterpreted his letter than the story that has him forging the letter and being really deceitful. But the letter withstands that test. There's the conspiracy that it requires, and the odds are so astronomical. Okay, another thing is that the letter purportedly from Joseph Smith, see again, they're going to say purportedly again, you can never just say the letter, but the document is written in all capitals, uncharacteristics of Joseph's handwriting. How often did Joseph actually write? You know, when he was in jail, yeah, he wrote in jail. All the other times he didn't write because it was horrible. And if you read what he wrote in jail, the spelling is atrocious. It's just, you know, that's what Emma said about him. You know, he couldn't write a letter. He had to be a prophet. He definitely couldn't write the Book of Mormon. Okay. Joseph Smith likely would have used letter writing services like scriveners. Being in a position of leadership in the church, and outside authorities do not dispute the authenticity of the wording of the document as characteristic of Joseph's education and style. And I agree. And that's coming from the adversary, the Brighamites, and I agree with that statement. Very nice of you to tell the truth. The last thing in dispute of its authenticity is Joseph Smith's signature at the end of it. The difficulty there is that even if the signature were not penned by Joseph, it would not inherently cast doubt on the authenticity of the document, since he frequently allowed others to sign for him. And it is therefore difficult to know which signature is, period. I think they were trying to say which signature is his. And it has to be pointed out, at this time, a lot of people in the U.S. could not read and write, right? So they didn't even have near the same kind of First of all, people were more honest back then, I do believe. Secondly, when you got a society that people can't write anyway, nobody was obsessed. Nowadays, you can't even, like, if I tell you, go ahead and sign for me, it's okay, and I give you permission, chances are you're going to say, not me, I'm not going to do it, I'm not guilty of identity theft or anything, That's not the world we were living in back then. Back then, people would sign for other people. It was an honesty thing, handshake, people were honest. People knew each other, you couldn't get away with stuff. So, nearly as much. Now, I'm not saying there weren't dishonest people, but people knew who they were. So, the strongest point against the document is therefore ambiguity. Now, again, it's not. That's just what they're clinging to because they don't want to read it for what it is. And that's all that there is to it. And I'll let you read it yourself. You'll find the document. I'll put a link. You can read it. You decide. But think about the character traits of a prophet. Let's see. Thy duty is made plain. I'll just read the end of it. Thy duty is made plain, and if thou lackest wisdom, ask of God, in whose hands I trust thee. And he will give thee unsparingly, for if evil befalls me, thou shalt lead the flock to pleasant pastures. He's clearly saying, the flock that I lead will find rest with you, and you'll lead them to pleasant pastures. And again, that's just page 3. All pages contain references to him being the prophet. Okay, so here's where Fair Mormon gets, and I want to tell you, like, this is very, very charitable compared to what these anti-Mormon writers, like, they're trying to be inflammatory, they're trying to make money. All his biographers, not one biographer who is a Latter-day Saint believer has written for him so far. We've got John Hychek's working on it. He's going to have a book. Maybe some other books are out there. Bill Shepard wrote a book of teachings of James Strang, but it doesn't have the history. It doesn't really. And Wingfield Watson wrote some great stuff in his defense. It's apologetic works, but again, where histories go, they're all written by non-members. As a matter of fact, the first man, I think it was Quaife, Milo Quaife, or one of them was actually Fawn Brodie's mentor, if that gives you an idea. Now, Fawn Brodie, she fictionalizes Joseph Smith. She puts thoughts in everybody's head. She assumes that anybody saying anything bad is telling the gospel truth, and anybody saying anything positive for Joseph, she attacks in every way that either they're deceived or they're dishonest or what have you. But she very naively trusts anybody saying anything, and that's just, it doesn't make any sense. If people are, keep in mind, if there's a lot of people that are willing to murder a person because they believe that, somehow it's justified because they're, dishonest, just think of how many times, an order of magnitude more people are going to be willing to tell a little white lie in order to stop somebody. They won't even think of it as a sin, right? If this guy is offending God with his fraudulent Bible and faking being a prophet of God, he belongs in the 9th circle of hell and he's leading people to damnation. If that's the distortion going on in somebody's head, then if they have to tell a little lie, like the person that Fawn reports on that said, yeah, Joseph was laughing and told me that he had made up the whole story to fool his family, and the fools fell for it. You know, sure, like Joseph's going to have this whole elaborate, even if it was a lie, you know, that he's going to fool his family, his closest friends, every single person in his life, and this one person is not even in his inner circle, take into his confidence and just, let me tell you about what I'm doing. It makes no sense at all, you know, and the point is that you've got somebody who's after the fact, after he's dead, he can't come back. I mean, somebody insignificant telling anti-Mormons what they want to hear, and you don't question it at all. That kind of bias, you know, you couldn't have do it with a straight face, being called on it. But anyway, so he says Book of Mormon witnesses. Okay. So they have two columns here, and they're comparing. So Book of Mormon, or equivalent, 3 witnesses. Joseph Smith, yes. James Strang, no. And they've got a string of no's in the James Strang column that are all yeses. They've completely distorted this thing. Joseph had 3 witnesses, and he had 8 witnesses, and they were a little bit different in the things that they witnessed. James Strang had 4 witnesses, and he had 7. They come to the same number combined. Technically, they're for 2 different sets of plates, but I don't think that, why would that matter? The 7 witnesses who witnessed the Book of the Law of the Lord plates, those witnesses are identical in character and nature to the 8 witnesses of Joseph Smith. Meaning there's nothing supernatural other than the plates themselves, right? And they, you know, Joseph led them right to the stump, wherever they were in the woods, according to depictions, and let them handle the plates, and there's nothing supernatural, so they get a nice, very realistic description. The 3 witnesses saw the plates, but also saw an angel, so you get a more ethereal testimony. And James's 4 witnesses also get a more miraculous witness. And I'll get into that. But at this point, I'm going to say yes, and although they're going to say no, James's witnesses did not deny their testimonies. There's no statement that I'm aware of, or that any of the other Strangites are aware of, that any of these people said, no, I didn't hold plates, no, James is, you know, is a liar. There's some second-hand testimony from some other people, but that's hearsay, right? And saying that you know, they left the church, right? Well, a bunch of Joseph's witnesses also left the church for one reason or another. So we don't have to have witnesses who stay with the prophet, and you know, people leave because their feelings are hurt. You know, that's just the way people are. They get their feelings hurt, they'll cut their nose to spite their face, and you know that about people. So shared visionary experiences. Yes, multiple with Joseph Smith. James, they're saying no. And first of all, that's not true, because we had a whole room of people who, when James ordained, there was glowing. People's heads were glowing. And, you know, there's anti-Mormon type theories that try to explain this, but the fact of the matter is the entire town around James, all these people that were present, were buzzing and talking about this for weeks nonstop. So if it was something that fooled people, it fooled a lot of people. It did its job. Largely, you've got a couple of fringe people who propose multiple possibilities of how it could be done, but that doesn't prove a thing. So under the topic of shared visionary experiences, it has to be yes, just on that alone. Now, if I, you know, dig back into history, I haven't read these books in 7-8 years, but I probably find more. Okay, so uttered prophecies fulfilled. Yes for Joseph, James for no. This is ridiculous. Ridiculous. And when we get into, I just looked up Wingfield Watson for the first time. I was reading one of the things he wrote, and he's talking about all the prophecies that the letter of appointment fulfills alone. And yes, those are technically prophecies of Joseph Smith, right? I mean, the receiver doesn't matter because prophets can't predict the future. Prophets don't know anything. They're human beings, right? The only thing a prophet can do is listen. And if he's listening to God, he's listening to somebody who does know the future. But the prophet doesn't know anything until he hears it, you know, with spiritual ears or physical ears, what have you. Bottom line, the thing is that there were prophecies that were fulfilled, multiple prophecies fulfilled by James Strang received that are in writing, but the letter of appointment contains multiple ones alone. And if Joseph wrote it, then James is definitely a prophet and the one that he chose, period, end of story. And if Joseph didn't write it, then whoever did knew the future. Because, you know, you can't say no. So that's technically a lie to say no, that James had no uttered prophecies fulfilled. It's ridiculous. Continued church expansion. Joseph, yes. James, no. What do you call opening 2 coal steaks? What are you talking about? You know, he got murdered. You know, what was he going to do when he didn't get murdered? You know, I mean, 2 steaks is expansion of growth already, so that's a yes. And, you know, you kind of, you know, somebody cut his life short. So, anyway. Leading church authority. Okay, here's where they get really dishonest. Because Joseph, it says president. James, it says king. There is not a single doubt that James was the president of the church. And here's really dishonest because FAIRMORMON knows that Joseph Smith was ordained king also. They know it in the presence of the Council of 50. It was done in secret. It wasn't widely known, but it's well known now, and you better believe the historians know it, the church knows it, and these people know it. So to say president here and James king, they should both say president/king, period. And you know what? Nobody in their right mind is going to say that James doesn't sit in the same position as Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith sit in the same position as Moses. And we know that Moses is a prophet and a king. You know, there's multiple names that describe the same thing, but Moses was a king. It says it in Deuteronomy, in Sefer HaYashar, in multiple ancient sources. And it says it in the book of the law of the Lord. Moses was king in Israel. So, assistants. Joseph calls them counselors. James calls them viceroys. Viceroys are counselors. And as you go through, what they did was cherry-picked the titles that are recorded in the ancient book of the law, the Torah of Israel, under a kingship. And you know, and they just took him out of here. But the official names for the church, I mean, yes, he was those things under the kingdom, but they didn't lay down. The structure of the church is the same. You've got a king with 2 viceroys. It says in here. It says that that's what these people are. And so this is also really dishonest of them, because if they got these names from the book of the law, then they had to read the sections that went with them that explained this. Then you can read it. Read the book of the law for yourself. So apostles, it says princes in his kingdom. They're apostles. They were apostles after James died. Lorenzo Dow Hickey was the last apostle. Okay? They didn't stop being apostles. High priest, nobles. No, a high priest, a high priest. Priests, what? Sacrifictors and singers. Teachers, Rabboni, yeah, well, what do you think a rabbi is? It means teacher. Hello? We have several classes of teacher. That's very true. There's a rabboni, a rabbi, a doctor, a ruler, and a teacher. It's just further developing, but the category is still the same. Anyway, what they did that was not very honest at all, because it says right here, by their fruits will you know them. Many have wondered how James Strang might be different than Joseph Smith. There are several ways in which they differ. It is important to know these differences. For by their fruits shall you know them. Well, what about your dishonesty? Because that's going to tell me a lot about you and your presentation. What you didn't do is put Brigham Young on here and see how he compares, because James is way closer to Joseph Smith than Brigham Young. Brigham Young immediately tried to abolish the first presidency. He did it in writing. He said there's going to be no more prophet, and that's why there was no prophet for 3 whole years, and it wasn't until James Strang, people were leaving and saying, well, I want to go be where there's a first president, where things aren't the same, you're switching everything around, where he says, well, maybe I do need to put myself in the first presidency. So really an afterthought that Brighamite Utah Mormons have a first presidency today, because that was not Brigham Young's intention, and he made that clear. And it's only because of James Strang that that church looks anything like, and they still changed the offices. So so here, okay, eternal marriage, temple ceremony for Joseph Smith. You know, that's not really well established. You're kind of letting history taint, the history of the last 150 years taint what came before that. Anyhow. So, okay, ordination of women. It says that Joseph didn't, but I think that the evidence shows he wasn't really pronouncing it, but there's tons and tons of quotes that show that women in the Relief Society can ordain each other, that they were called a priesthood office, they got to lay hands and heal the sick and do all these things that priests do. It's pretty clear what direction Joseph was going. And that really shows something about James Strang. First of all, we know there is precedent in the Bible for both the female priesthood and the apostate suppression of the female priesthood. And Joseph knew this, and he's going in that direction. James intuitively knew and carried on the work. Now, I keep describing this. When James took over, the church was really, really close to what Joseph Smith's church was when he died. But understand that we're talking about a trajectory. Right? A lot of critics say to Joseph Smith, well, you're making this up as you go along. The church keeps changing. What's up? Well, yeah, you're thinking that it's supposed to be so simple. You just come and fix it like that, and people are going to follow along. You can't rip someone's reality away from them. You can't make them change so much so fast. You got to do it incrementally. Line upon line, precept upon precept. Here a little, and there a little, until you come to a fullness of truth. So Joseph is this trajectory of a changing church, okay? And, he died, and, well, the Brighamites definitely didn't stay there. They definitely innovated afterwards. But that's what James did, too. He got revelation, And so let's look at their fruits. What kind of innovations? Are we talking about Adam-God doctrine? Are we talking about the institution of racism? And the banning blacks from the priesthood. I mean, these are the innovations you need to compare. We got one person who's saying no women priests, no black people priests, and you got somebody who's ordaining black people and women, who's being progressive like a good person. You can't compare Brigham Young to James Strang because, as I said, Strang wasn't perfect, but you put him next to Brigham Young and he looks like an angel. So, okay, now, let's see. Oh, of what did the Strangite witnesses testify? So 4 witnesses who testified that they themselves had dug up the Brodie plates from the ground where Strang said that they would be discovered. Okay, so Strang saying where they're going to be discovered, that is a prophecy, right? And you can say, you know, look, you've got to think, is there something that this person can say that will convince me? And if your answer is no, and especially you give a 50-50, but either way is wrong, you have a problem. You have identified that you have a bias and you can't be convinced. So you now have to be honest and say, look, I can't believe no matter what. There's nothing this person's going to say that's going to be right. You got to understand when you backed somebody in a corner, right? So James records that he had a vision, and that in the spirit he took him to the spot, and that the ground became hollow like water, and he could see through it, and he could see the plates under the ground shining like a stone in water, so he knew the exact spot. This was the whole point, was that God was going to create witnesses and reveal him the plates. So if you can't believe that that can happen, then there's no point in having a discussion. But you can't be a Joseph Smith believer either. So, but the whole point is the description that these 4 men have is so careful. It is the best and most solid testimony. It beats the testimony that's recorded in the Book of Mormon. And I'll read it to you right now. But they're going to fault find it. It's the most solid that it could be. And if this doesn't work for you, you got to admit that nothing would. We should not lose sight of what it was that the Strangite witnesses bore their testimony in a manner clearly intended to replicate the 3 and 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. Now here, their phraseology is disparaging it, right? Again, there's that you can't do it right, because if you don't replicate the Book of Mormon witnesses, they're going to say, look, we expect it to be like the Book of Mormon witnesses. Why didn't you do it, right? Where's your witnesses? But if you do it, right, if you do provide the witnesses and the evidence to back it up, well, you're copying. Well, how is that copying? For a Mormon to say this, you know, that's why I say it's ridiculous when you say, you know, the anti-Mormons say that Joseph Smith plagiarized the Bible. There's Matthew and then there's Isaiah. Well, you know, so what? That's there, honestly. Like, it's not 20% of the text. And if you just take 20% of it out and just pretend he didn't do that. Like, it's not already impressive to be able to recite 20% of the Book of Mormon as exactly as it is from the Bible, with your face in a hat. I mean, in some ways that would be harder than actually just making it up something, right? So that's impressive alone. But if you take that away, you've still got a heck of a large book, right? So there's a reason why it's there. It's not there just to pad the book. It explained what these things meant in a different light that was very, very relevant, not only to shedding light on mysteries from the Bible that Christians have no explanation for, but also in predicting what's going to come in the pattern that this restoration is going to follow. Very relevant. But God, if you call it the Word of God, God gets to copy himself. You know, I get to write a book and I get to hack up my first book and regurgitate part of it in my future work if I want to. You know, it's my right as an author. And if the Holy Spirit is inspiring that, you don't get to call it plagiarism, right? You know, if the whole book was like that, sure. But, you know, the Book of Mormon could easily be 20% smaller and still be a large, very substantial history and theological work, and everything else that's beautiful about it is still present. So it's completely irrelevant. So back to the copying Joseph Smith. Same God is doing it. He's following patterns. You know, he doesn't have to. I'm going to tell you that. He doesn't have to provide witnesses. Period. There's no law that says you've got to do it. Joseph Smith was the first prophet in the history of prophets that has a title page written. The books in the Bible don't even have autographs. There is nothing left to go back to that century to establish them. Joseph is the first to even propose the idea of having outside witnesses. Okay? Muhammad did not have them, nor did he need them. Now, we have modern witnesses to testify to Muhammad. You know, read Nephi chapter 1. The things that happened with Muhammad, those prophecies, those visions, those two first visions that Daniel C. Peterson talks about are identical to the two that Lehi experienced. And that is a witness for you today. Not saying that Islam is not apostate and got a lot of falsehood, that people in charge haven't just fabricated verses and changed things. You've got, you know, just like the famous adulterer's Bible, where they were printing off the Bible and it said, you know, thou shalt not commit adultery, and they accidentally left the word not off and published it, and it got out, and everybody's like, it says thou shalt commit adultery in the Ten Commandments. I mean, if you're handwriting stuff, there's instances where that happened, a reverse of a meaning occurred. Anyway, so basically, if you're going to point to a verse and say it says this and it's false, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It got changed. It doesn't matter. So anyway, on the 13th day of September, 1845, we, Aaron Smith, So Strang produced 4 witnesses who testified that they themselves had dug the Vori plates from the ground where he said they would be discovered. Their detailed written testimony was used by Strang in the Vori Herald and in Zion's Reveille, his newspapers, and the Gospel Herald, and it reads as following. On the 13th day of September 1845, we, Aaron Smith, James M. Van Nostrand, and Edward Whitcomb assembled at the call of James J. Strang, who is by us and many others approved as a prophet and seer of God. He proceeded to inform us that it had been revealed to him in a vision that an account of an ancient people was buried in a hill south of White River Bridge near the east line of Walworth County, and leading us to an oak tree about a foot in diameter. Told us that we would find it enclosed in a case of rude earthenware under that tree at the depth of about 3 feet. Okay? Requested us to dig it up and charge us to so examine the ground that we should know we were not imposed upon, and that it had not been buried there since the tree grew. The tree was surrounded by a sward of deeply rooted grass, such as is usually found in the openings, and upon the most critical examination we could not discover any indication that it had ever been cut through or disturbed. We then dug up the tree and continued to dig to the depth of about 3 feet, where we found a case of slightly baked clay containing the 3 plates of brass. On one side of one, there's a landscape view of the south end of Gardner's Prairie and the range of hills where they were dug. On another is a man with a crown on his head and a scepter in his hand. Above is an eye before an upright line, below the sun and the moon and the stars with 12 stars. At the bottom are 12 large stars from 3 of which pillars arise, and closely interspersed with them are 70 very small stars. So we've got the structure of the church. The other four sides are very close. By the way, and we've got this imagery of a king and the scepter, and this is several years before. So this would be 1845. Yes, September 1845. He was crowned king on November 9, 1850. So 5 years later. 5 years go by, and this comes to fruition. So the other four sides are very closely covered with what appear to be alphabetic characters, but in a language of which we have no knowledge. The case was found embedded in indurated clay, so closely fitting that it broke in taking out. And the earth below the soil was so hard as to be dug with difficulty, even with a pickaxe. Over the case was found a flat stone, okay, of about 1 foot wide each way and 3 inches thick. This is going to be really important when we get to these testimonies of how this was faked. Which appear to have undergone the action of fire and fell in pieces after a few minutes exposure to the air. The digging extended in the clay about 18 inches, there being 2 kinds of earth of different color and appearance above. We examined as we dug all the way with the utmost care, and we say with utmost confidence that no part of the earth through which we dug exhibited any sign or indication that it had been moved or disturbed at any time previous. The roots of the tree struck down on every side very closely, extending below the case, and closely interwoven with roots from other trees. None of them had been broken or cut away. No clay is found in the country like that of which the case is made. In fine, we found an alphabetic and pictorial record carefully cased up, buried deep in the earth, covered with a flat stone, with an oak tree 1 foot in diameter growing over it, with every evidence that the sense can give that it has lain there as long as that tree has been growing. Strang took no part in the digging, but kept entirely away from before the first blow was struck till after the plates were taken out of the case. And the sole inducement to our digging was our faith in his statement as a prophet of the Lord that a record would thus and there be found. Okay, question. What are the differences between Strangite witness statements and those of the 3 and 8 witnesses to the Book of Mormon? Well, we have credible witnesses to the Book of Mormon that say that they saw these plates that had the appearance of gold, and they were very real. But we don't have them digging out under those circumstances from the ground, with every indication that they had been there for as long as the tree had grown, with the roots on every side interwoven with other roots. No one doubts, so here's what FAIRMORMON says. No one doubts that Strang had a set of a few very small metallic plates in his possession, yet thousands of people saw them, or that they were removed from the earth in the manner reported above. In that sense, there would be nothing for his witnesses to deny. Wrote Daniel C. Peterson in Defending the Faith, the story behind James Strang and his sect in Deseret News. Wow, Deseret News covered this. The 2 sets of inscribed plates that Strang claimed to have found in Wisconsin and Michigan beginning in 1845 almost certainly existed. Milo Quaif's early standard biography of Strang reflects that while Strang's angelic visitations may have had only a subjective existence in the brain of the man who reported them, the metallic plates possessed a very material, objective reality. Here it says, and they were almost certainly forgeries, but they're not going to say one thing to substantiate that. And there's literally nothing here. The three Vori or Raja Manchu plates were dug up by 4 witnesses whom Strang had taken to the plate's burial place, illustrated and inscribed on both sides. The Raja Manchu plates were roughly 1.5 inches by 2.75 inches in size, 2.75 inches, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand or to carry in a pocket. Okay? Almost certainly a forgeries. Well, if they've been in the ground as long as the tree has grown there, then it's almost certainly not a forgery. Because how is Strang going to know that he needs these things so far in the past that this tree has been there if that's even in his lifetime? Some of Strang's witnesses later repudiated their testimonies, and one witness later admitted helping to fabricate the plates. Now, this is an outright lie. None of Strang's witnesses ever repudiated their testimonies. They maintained them till they died. There's a report that one of them said it's quote unquote all from man. That's a second-hand quote, denying the divinity of them, but again, not denying the plates. Like you said, there's nothing for them to deny. They have real plates. The people claiming to have fabricated plates don't have credible testimonies at all, and they're not the witnesses anyway. So again, they're like the person with Joseph Smith who made up a story that Joseph confessed to him that Joseph made up all of Mormonism out of a fiction in his mind. Okay, so here's a quote. It says, ex-Strangite Isaac Scott, who was once a leader in the Strangite church. Okay, he was part of the High Council in Vori. Stated that Caleb P. Barnes told him that he and Strang, so right now we've got hearsay, right? We've got a disaffected member telling us what someone else said, and if you check the dates, he's reporting in 1888, okay? James Strang died in 1856. So we're talking about 32 years later is you get some hearsay from a disaffected member who is now part of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay? So keep this in perspective, right? The same people who go on a mission to defend Joseph Smith from exactly these kinds of statements and accusations and distortions and half-truths are now taking up the methods of the anti-Mormons and turning them against James Strang. Stated that Caleb Barnes was James Strang's law partner, okay? Not a Mormon, James Strang's law partner, but he did pick up the letter of appointment from the post office and bring it to James. Told him that he and Strang had actually fabricated the plates. According to Scott, the men, and here we get our made-up story, made the plates out of Ben Purse's old kettle and engraved them with an old file saw. And when completed, they put acid on them to corrode them and give them an ancient appearance. And that to deposit them under the tree where they were found, they took a large auger, which Ben Purse owned, and put a fork handle on the auger, and with it bored a long slanting hole under the tree on the Hill of Promise, as they called it, laying the earth on a trail of cloth, as taken out, and then put the plates in, tamping all the earth again, leaving no trace of their work visible. Okay, my question is, if that's true, how did you get the stone under there that's a foot wide on each side with a slanted auger when the ground is so hard it was hard to get through with a pickaxe, and you're digging through so if it's 3 feet down and you're going slant, you got 6 feet with a fork handle through hard packed dirt, through roots that are intertwined with other tree roots. This story is a complete fabrication just on face value. I mean, Fair Mormon, you've lost credibility. You said, by their fruits shall you know them. You know you're lying to your people right here. Peterson continues. Among the many who saw them was Stephen Post, who reported that they were brass, and indeed that they resembled the French brass used in familiar kitchen kettles. It's just an opinion of somebody's, right? We don't know if he's being honest, and we don't know if it's, even if he was being honest, if that means anything at all. Brass is brass. With all the faith and confidence that I could exercise, he wrote, all that I could realize was that Strang made the plates himself. Okay, well, what they're not quoting us, they're quoting somebody, Stephen Post, that's a familiar name. I can look up, let's look up and see who Stephen Post is. Because I can't remember everything. No, okay, so he's not a famous Strangite, because he's not on my list of 150 famous Strangites. So Warren Post, that's why I know the name. Well, he could have maybe or maybe not related to Warren Post. But anyhow, okay, so there's a much better testimony by the news reporters that came and looked it over and said the exact opposite. And I'll read that to you, but the crux of what the newspaper man wrote in the journalist, who's not a Mormon, who went to investigate, looking for something crazy to write about, and he gets there, and he's holding the plates, and he's hearing all the testimonies, and he says, everybody seems like they're very honest, and with everything looks like it's totally perfect in a story, but the story has to be impossible because it's just not possible, right? Doesn't believe that it's in any way possible. It has to be a lie. But he says, when I can't discover the lie, I'm just going to have no opinion about it at all and state none. So it's a very honorable perspective to have. I love people like that just admit that, look, I can't believe it no matter what. I can't believe it for personal reasons. Right? I don't see a problem with it. I'm not going to call you stupid. I'm not going to say whatever. I'm not going to make it something it's not. I'm just going to say, I can't believe it for personal reasons. I love those people, right? Because the rest of them won't own up to that, right? And have to make up reasons why, you're wrong for believing it. Anyway, so you've got that testimony. Do we read that? No. We read somebody saying that they think it's fake. Okay, so that's an opinion. Why are we reading someone's opinion? All that I could realize was Strang made him himself, or at least that it was possible that he made him, right? So this person is saying it's possible. Is he considering the testimony of these witnesses? One source reports that most of the 4 witnesses to the plates ultimately repudiated their testimonies. Fair Mormon, if you actually had a source to give us Wouldn't there be a name here? Wouldn't there be a citation? You've got citations down here for everything else. There's little numbers here, just like on Wikipedia, where I can click and see what that is. But all you say here is one source reports that most of the 4 witnesses to the Rajamandchu plates ultimately reputed their testimonies. Why have I not heard that source? Why are you not telling us that source? Because you're lying. You know, this is a research paper. You're not a schmuck, right? This is not a blog. This is FAIRMORMON's official response. You guys do all kinds of research. You can't, I mean, either you made that up or you had a lead that you could have followed, right? The 18 plates of Laban, likewise of brass, and each about 7.5. Now remember, this is from the Book of Mormon, right? They have to be brass, you know, because that's what they are, right? The 18 plates of brass, likewise of brass, each about 7.5 by 9 inches, okay? So you've got a really short account that was short and sweet to the point, and you want to make a deal about it being small, but these are 7.5 by 9 inches. They were seen by 7 witnesses in 1851. They were first mentioned in 1849. The witnesses' testimonies was published as a preface, which Strang said he derived from the plates of Laban. It was a preface to the Book of the Law, which came from the plates of Laban. He appears to have begun the translation at least as early as April 1849. An 84-page version appeared in 1851. By 1856, it had reached 350 pages. Well, why aren't you saying why, right? All he did was print an expanded book that has a whole bunch of notes in it. Okay, same revelations in there. He added a couple of modern revelations to it, and you know, there might be some extra sections, but I don't. It's all notes. You know, it's right here. He's got everything here. You know, he's got text that's larger print that is from the plates, and then he's got the smaller print, which is notes, and there's probably 4 times as much that he wrote as supplemental material, right? To better use this as a complete guide to living in the modern era. So Strang's witnesses report seeing the plates but mention nothing miraculous. You mean exactly like the 8 witnesses? That you said it's really important that they don't see the miraculous thing because then we don't question their credulity, that they just give a very straightforward testimony to the physical existence of plates? You know, why is that? Why are you harping on how important that is for Joseph Smith and mentioning it here and not saying that? Nor did Strang supply any additional supporting testimony comparable to that of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. Well, the unusual circumstance of his vision and digging them up out of the ground and that they couldn't have been there, that is the equivalent to the angel, right? As a matter of fact, people think that the angel story is made up, that these guys might have been crazy or hypnotized somehow, but how do you hypnotize someone to say, look very carefully and document and describe the manner you pull them up to make sure I'm not imposing on you, right? Okay, that is the miracle. It is exactly like the 3 witnesses. It's not exactly in the same way, but it's analogous. It's in a different form. And again, this goes back to they said, well, it's clearly meant to copy the 3 and the 8 witnesses. Well, no. Why would you say that? First of all, you've got 3 and 8. You've got 4 and 7. Okay, they match up to the same number, but you know, if you were wanting to really copy, you could copy, right? Secondly, it's not. Joseph never had anybody dig anything out of the ground like that, you know. So anyway, One of the witnesses to the plates of Laban, Samuel P. Bacon, eventually denied the inspiration of Strang's movement and denounced it as mere human invention. Again, we have nothing from Samuel Bacon saying that. We have somebody else who was talking smack about Samuel Bacon for leaving the church, and it could be true or not true, but again, it doesn't detract from his witness testimony. Another, Samuel Graham, later claimed that he had actually assisted Strang in the creation of the plates. Let's see. That comes to us from a letter from Chauncey Loomis to Joseph Smith III. Again, it's hearsay, and it's dated, it was published in Saints Herald 10 November 1888. That speaks for itself, but we'll get to that. We'll see. So there's nothing from the actual people. Now keep in mind, all of these people outlived James Strang. This was big news. If they had a testimony to deliver, there were reporters willing to pay for it. There were Utah Mormons willing to pay for it. There were tons of people wanting to hear it. Tons of people. Okay? That's how we know that this is all a lie. Because Strang is dead in the ground in 1856. All these people who allegedly know something are walking around amongst people who desperately want to hear it. And they know it. And there's nothing to tell, right? But you've got these secondhand stories that show up 30 years later saying so-and-so told me. So-and-so told me. And that's the thing about a lie, is how do you disprove something that somebody made up? You can't. And if that's your requirement to prove something, then nobody could ever prove anything. You've got a non-disprovable hypothesis. It's completely baseless. Letter from Chauncey Loomis to Joseph Smith III. Well, what? Reassuring his prophet president that I'm not a Strangite anymore, and there's nothing to this Strangism. You don't have to worry about it. Whatever reason he's writing to him, but he doesn't have any proof. We want to hear from the people themselves. Okay, so here's the testimony. So this is an image of page 719 of the Saints Herald, dated 10 November 1888. As Chauncey Loomis writing. Now, make some statements in regard to the others. Who were the chief men of the kingdom? Brother Samuel Graham, I think, president of the 12, declared that he and Strang made those plates that Strang claimed to translate the book of the law from. But they, in the first place, prepared the plates and coated them with beeswax, and then formed the letters and cut them in with a penknife, and then exhibited them to the rest of the 12. Again, this would have been pertinent information at the time. The facts were Graham apostatized and left the island, taking his family and Strang's first wife, Mary, with him to Brodie. Okay? Don't get the impression that he ran off with Mary, because that's not true. But she did go back to, stay in Brodie. Wisconsin, at the time Strang was at Detroit, Michigan. His wife never returned to him. When Strang got shot and he was still alive, he went back to Mary's house in Brodie, and she cared for him. He saw her. It's not like he didn't see her, but she didn't live on the island. And she was never a Mormon, by the way. At this time, Strang was, he had 4 others besides, and some concubines. That is not true. he had 4 other wives and no concubines. Brother Samuel Bacon says that in repairing Strang's house, he found hid behind the ceiling the fragments of those plates from which Strang made the Book of the Law. He turned infidel and left the island. One more item, and then I close. In regard to Strang's letter of appointment from your beautiful temple was burned, and the inhabitants of Zion have been under the chastising hand of the Almighty ever since. He says, but I think Strang has been weighed in the balances and found wanting. I cannot say, but what he received the letter of appointment from your father, I think perhaps that may be true, but I think if he did, he made bad use of it. Chauncey Loomis. Okay, so here's what's wrong about that. First of all, he claims that Samuel Bacon, in repairing Strang's house, found hid behind the ceiling the fragments of those plates which Strang made the Book of the Law from. Okay, this is impossible. For one thing, there's fragments left over from the creation of this. First of all, if he turned infidel finding it and saying, you made the plates and I'm going to leave, why didn't Sam Graham, first of all, take those fragments with him as proof and go to the papers and expose the whole thing right there? You know, he's a member of the church with friends in this community, and he's going to, well, ask yourself, what are you going to do? You know, you find out that you've been lied to by a false prophet, and your friends in the church, you don't bother to tell any of them what happened, you just leave. And somehow, in the rest of your life, nobody hears the story but Chauncey Loomis, and Chauncey Loomis doesn't tell anybody for 30 years. Okay, here's the other reason why this doesn't work. Well, it doesn't make any sense that these fragments that James supposedly left over from fabricating brass plates, which is not easy, by the way, especially in 1850, why is he going to hide them behind the ceiling? Behind the ceiling. He's just going to stick them there? Okay, here's why that doesn't work. Okay, Strang got shot, and you know, he was in really bad shape. He got multiple shots, a bullet lodged in his spine, pounded on his face with the butt of a gun, and he had a bullet lodged in his head. Okay, he couldn't go hide these fragments. We have no indication that any conversation ever happened about them. But if these things are hidden in his house anywhere, the anti-Mormons that hate him, that passionately hated him, and all the Mormons that were at war with them from Mackinac across the lake, they stormed in. They rounded up all the Mormons. They weren't even allowed to pack a bag, and they took them and scattered them on different ports up and down the river. Okay? And they moved into their houses. So one of these anti-Strang hating Mormons moved into James Strang's house. And in all the time that they owned that house, and any repairs that ever took place, and people knew whose house it was, believe you me, nobody ever reported doing some repairs and finding these fragments. They would be there. So again, we've got folklore and made up stories that don't even pass the logic test, and they're being repeated by FAIRMORMON, and you know how they go to bat for Joseph Smith. So you've got a double standard here, and of course you do, because Brigham Young and their whole church doesn't have a leg to stand on as far as its authority claims. Okay, so let's take a look at what Wingfield Watson, so I just read this for the first time. I've known Wingfield Watson, who he was and what he did, and I haven't really read very much from him, but let's see. So, okay, here he says, the witnesses to those plates in Vori tell us, so this is from the volume 3 of the prophetic controversy. The witnesses of those plates in Vori tell us that the case containing them was found embedded in indurated, hardened clay, so closely fitting that it broke in taking it out. That is, the case was so embedded in the hardened earth all around that it broke the case in taking it out of its bed in that clay. The case itself was made of baked clay, resembling that from which the white Milwaukee brick is made, and under Scott's tamping process must have been pounded all to pieces. So the guy who reports this auger story. A flat stone 1 foot wide each way and 3 inches thick. So I've never read this part of this. I read much early in the document just now, but this is the same stuff that I was saying. That a flat stone 1 foot wide each way and 3 inches thick was found over the case containing the record. And we are just a little curious to know how that stone ever got in so far under that tree through a hole or 2.5 inch, through a 2 or 2.5 inch auger hole. Will not Scott inform us? Perhaps he will say that stone was always there, but if so, how did the party manage to divine its existence so as to get that record right under it? Was not that a very fortunate hit on their part? The reorganization being based upon self-evident lies and falsehood, it will no doubt be pleased with Scott's lying testimony, for that which is based upon lies must be constantly supported by lies. So now I'm not as against the reorganized church. I'm pretty favorable to it all in all, but its reasons for decanonizing Strang, because the reorganized church was all Strangites, right? Some of them left when the polygamy thing happened and they didn't like the polygamy, and that's fair enough. But the rest of them were faithful Strangites, but Strang had talked about Joseph III being a prophet one day, so they completely expected him to, and when he became the leader of that church, it was a fulfillment of prophecy that was uttered by both Joseph and James. So they had every reason to believe that, and they were waiting for a new prophet. And James' apostle, Lorenzo Hickey, was telling everybody, let's join. So there's faithful Strangites. And they got into a bitter feud in the early days, talking about whether Strang was a prophet, and whether the book of the law is scripture, and whether Saturday is the Sabbath. And ultimately, they decided that they were going to stick with the Sunday Sabbath. They were not going to use Strang because, at this point, the Smith family is so exhausted from the controversies, and they're so exhausted from having Joseph Smith attacked as a polygamist by Brigham Young and his apostles and their witnesses and everything that they tried to do. They really persecuted this family. So yes, they don't want to hear anything about Mormonism and polygamy. They don't want to hear about James being a polygamist. Even though James had 5 wives, he had the most that any Strangite had. Most Strangites were monogamous. They never made it a thing you had to do. They just said there's a biblical precedent for polygamy. You can't really be a Christian if you say polygamy is wrong, because the Bible never says polygamy is wrong, ever. It never says that. As a matter of fact, the Bible mandates under certain circumstances, so you're allowed to just do it. You're allowed to have multiple wives if you want, according to the Bible. Secondly, you, under certain circumstances, are commanded by Torah. You have to marry your brother's wife if he dies without offspring, And and raise up the offspring to your brother. Now that involves polygamy, because otherwise you would be raising offspring to your brother and not have offspring, or your own heir. So, and not only that, but throughout the whole New Testament era, Christians were polygamous. The oldest Christian document that we have is a letter that is written from one Christian to another, and I can pull it up, where he says, tell all your wives I said hello. It's an informal letter, but it proves that in the 2nd to 3rd century, Christians were still practicing polygamy, that they did not interpret those verses that everyone cites to, the ones that say you must marry a wife, that in order to be a deacon or a bishop, you've got to prove your fitness to lead a church family by showing that you have a family that you can lead. A very reasonable expectation that's very Jewish, very Hebrew. And the Hebrews were polygamists. The Christians were polygamists. The Greek word for a wife and one wife is the same. So the Greek does not say one wife. The English King James translators said one wife. Okay? Translators, not the apostle. And that's a really important thing to make. So again, it's fine if you want to be a 20th century conservative Protestant and have all these Western ideas that come from pagan Rome and interpret your faith through that. But to make a requirement, to write a law that God never said, and said Christians have to follow this, and one man, one woman, well, you're making stuff up. And you're telling God that his opinion is not needed because you've got this handled. Okay? It's the height of arrogance. It's oppressive. So bottom line, you can have more than one spouse. It's not required. And biblical law, James Strang, the Quran, all unanimously says that you have to treat them well, you have to have a real relationship. The book of the law says you should marry someone that you love and who loves you. Okay? It does not mean to have an obscene number of wives like Brigham Young's 55 wives, where they are just concubines at that point. They're little better than prostitutes. So there's a world of difference between those. But I don't blame the Smith family for having a prejudice and having their doctrinal opinions informed by that prejudice, and not being able to seek the Lord clearly enough to know that James was a fulfillment of prophecy, and that the value of the book of the law of the Lord far outweighs this idea that he may have done something inappropriate in having multiple wives, or and the bottom line is Brigham Young, one of his wives, escaped and wrote a scathing book expose about what a horrible person he is. James' wives all loved him so much that like 4 of them were pregnant, and I think 3 of them who had their babies after he died named them after him to honor him. So that's the difference that we're talking about. They talked happily about polygamy. Somebody said, well, I kind of wish it was just us, but wasn't really complaining. They loved him. He was wonderful. He was a wonderful leader, a wonderful man, a wonderful husband, a wonderful father. He would have been had people not murdered him for what? Anyway, back to this Christian document. Just to cover our bases here. We've got, let's see, this is in the epistles. Or no, I've got it saved under teachings. Teachings of the Apostles. Here we go. All right, that's one of the last ones. I think it's the letter of Arianus to Paulus, 230 AD, from one Christian brother to another. So he says, "Greetings, my Lord, my incomparable brother Paulus. I, Arianus, salute you, praying that all is as well as possible in your life. Since Menabios was going to you, I thought it necessary to salute you, as well as our Lord Father. Now I remind you about the gymnasiarchy, so that we are not troubled here, for Heraclides would be unable to take care of it, for he had been named to the city council. Find thus an opportunity that you buy the 2 auroras, but send me the fish liver sauce too, whichever you think is good. Our Lady Mother is well and salutes you, as well as your wives and sweetest children, and our brothers and all our people. Salute our brothers, Somethingines and Zides. All our people salute you. I pray you farewell in the Lord." Now, this is not a letter that was copied and circulated like the books of the New Testament. This is an autograph, something that we don't have of the books of the New Testament. And it shows that in the 3rd century, Christians were still polygamists. So, I'm going to call that theory about that it's something wrong with it to be disproven. So again, back to the prophetic controversy. He says, Isaac Scott, Captain Bogart's protege, that the brethren at a distance may know what reliance is to be placed in the statements of this delectable pseudo, who appears in the anti-Mormon New Era, endorser of William E. McClellan. We will simply say that he was a protege to Captain Bogart, a noble band of brothers, and that Bogart, McClellan, and Scott were associates. Scott told Bishop Fuller that he stood by Bogart while he murdered a man. And still he calls Bogart an excellent foster father. The following certificates will show Scott and McClellan's cooperation with the mob party for the consummation of their nefarious purposes. Vori, January 5th, 1847. To whom it may concern, this is certified that William E. McClellan commanded an anti-Mormon company who, with faces blackened, cooperated with other mob troops to deprive the Mormons of their possessions and drive them from the state. McClellan said, "I wish to God that I could see Joe Smith brought into the public square and beheaded. For if the God darned rascal is taken to liberty, he will escape." At this time, Joseph Smith and Hiram and Sidney and other prisoners were seated in a wagon, and 14 guns were presented to their breasts, but the general slaughter was prevented by the interference of John C. Ennis. McClellan was decorated with a variety of different colored ribbons upon his hat and shoulders and arms as a badge of distinction. M. Avery. Vori, January 25th, 1844. So these are probably the dates that it appeared in the Vori, in the newspaper. To whom it may concern, this is certified that Isaac Scott has for many years been regarded as a vile apostate. So this is long before this person told these stories about the witnesses of James Strang, and that he was, in consequence of his apostasy, removed from the office of chorister of the branch over which Emer Harris presided. D. Avery. Here it is, January 25th, 1847. To whom it may concern, this is certified that Isaac Scott told us that he was cut off from the church in Missouri, that he continued out of the church ever after until he came here. He has cooperated with the enemies of the church. In consequence of his treachery, he never had the confidence of the faithful and virtuous members. U.C.H. Nickerson and John McConnell. And then from Zion's Reveille, Volume 2, Number 7, the honest are beginning to see the knavery and treachery of such vile impostors as William E. McClellan, Collins Pemberton, and Isaac Scott. The inglorious trio of nefarious pseudos. They should be scorned like other scorpion pseudos by all respectable men, for their pens are like asps, their tongues like adders, and their breath like a breeze from the... I can't see what it says, but have charmed, this is a bad scan from a pamphlet. They have charmed the sirens, but like Lucifer, they have been cast out by the fiat of the Almighty to receive the perdition of ungodly men. A few years before Joseph and Hiram were killed, John C. Bennett wrote his expose of Mormonism, and Joseph Smith in particular, and this expose had no very little to do with the martyrdom of both Joseph and Hiram. After Joseph's death, Bennett seemed to be horror-stricken at what he had done. He came to Voree and in the deepest humility and tears confessed his wrongs and asked forgiveness. To be brief, he was received and remained in the church at Voree for a short period, but at length he again overtaken in crime is again cast out. But notwithstanding his confession and tears and penitence for what he had written, Isaac Scott and associates used to quote from and bear witness to the truth of Bennett's work, and now he thinks Bennett a very bad man, accusing him in connection with James of imposing upon innocent men and women with phosphorus and oil. So this is where we're getting this story that he used phosphorus and oil to fool everybody. That was just one of at least 3 theories that the non-Mormon, anti-Mormon writers, biographers, mentioned in their books on details that, you know, nobody seemed to notice but them, like the smell that would be produced from that. Testifying to his wicked teachings. From what I see in Scott's history and the history of his cronies, it would not be very hard for him to get up such sworn testimony. The difficulty seems to be to tell what they would not swear to against the life of a prophet of God and his followers. I noticed that one of the men whose sworn testimony he says he has is Moses Smith, brother to Aaron. No man ever did stronger in the faith of any man as a prophet of God than Moses Smith did in the faith of James. As Mr. Scott has been found before in the business of forging names to give currency and force to his slanders against Mr. Strang and others, we are about as much inclined to confide in his sworn testimonies as we have been in those collected by Dr. Hulbert and a number of others against Joseph and the Book of Mormon, and cannot but think that Isaac is now in his old pursuit. And he goes on and he writes a lot of really amazing things here. So you can actually find this. I found it on Internet Archive. There's a bunch. Just type in Wingfield, that's one word, Watson, W-A-T-S-O-N, and you'll find prophetic controversies. I think there's at least 1 through 12. And I have not read any of them up until today. But it's really amazing. Now, it's all the same arguments that I've been saying for years, but he's very eloquent in his presentation. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit to you of what, I mean, we're already almost 2 hours into this video, so why don't we just keep it going? You can stop it at any time and pick it up later. But here, let's see. So he's this number 3. He's talking about these people that made these claims, the stuff that that our anti-Mormon friends at FAIRLDS, FAIRMORMON, are taking as gospel truth. And he gives an answer, but he makes really solid arguments on why we shouldn't believe them, especially not if we believe Joseph. He says, the numerous efforts made by such men as Scott to show how Joseph Smith deceived his witnesses to palm a fraud on mankind to make money out of it are also like his rafting auger story to account for the discovery of the Vori record. But we cannot but think that it will do very well to class along with them the story that his disciples came and stole him away while he slept, like Jesus. While we slept, the disciples came and stole him away. Is not a whit more childish, vile, nor self-convincing than this same rafting auger story. If Joseph Smith's whole life and ministry had not been interpreted and construed in a very similar manner as Mr. Scott had construed Mr. Strang's life and ministry, we might be surprised at this second Spalding story. But isn't it a little curious that it has been apostate Mormons who have furnished the materials for all the meanest stories written against Joseph Smith? Begin with the Spalding story and trace this matter all the way up to the present time, and I think you will find that it is just such Mormons as Isaac Scott that have furnished the warp and the woof of the most diabolical stories written all along against Mormons and Mormonism. I hand a Mormon tract to a Baptist teacher some time ago to read, and he said, no, I want none of those things. When I want to know anything about the Mormons, I consult Mr. Beadle's works. That is, he consults the Mormon's meanest enemies when he wishes to learn anything about Mormons or Mormonism. Now, what is the difference between this Baptist preacher and his Orthodox brethren everywhere and those Mormons who take the exclusive testimony of Mr. Strang's meanest enemies against him? Mr. Strang was either what he claimed to be, that is, Joseph Smith's lawfully appointed successor, appointed by revelation from God through Joseph, and ordained by angels as Joseph was, or else he was about as great a criminal as he had stood on the earth in the last 1,000 years at least. But that's not true at all. But how to believe that as honorable a man as James J. Strang was known to be in his former life, all at once when he became a Mormon turned to be just such a criminal and got down to the low tricks of forging ancient records, palming them upon his fellow man, and lying in the name of Almighty God to make money, is something so mean and cowardly in itself that we will have to leave all such beliefs to the Scotts and the Hulberts and the Howes, who seem to be incapable of having an exalted or even a reasonable opinion of their fellow men. Great heavens, have the leaders of the Restoration got down at last upon a sectarian sandbank that they dread the light and have to resort to a refuge of lies to keep them from sinking. Right here we make the sweeping statement that whatever argument overthrows Mr. Strang's claims as a prophet of God and a successor to Joseph Smith will also overturn in like manner the claims of Joseph Smith. And if anyone doubts this, he may undertake to test it as soon as he pleases. Have you ever considered, reader, how much James J. Strang resembled Joseph Smith in his rascality anyhow? Joseph was brought up some 39 times before the different tribunals of his country, charged with all kinds of crimes, murder, treason, robbery, outrages of all kinds, and it is said that he was honorably acquitted every time except once for unlawful banking. Something that a lot of people were doing at the time was pretty customary, so they even jammed him on that on a technicality, just because it was him. So James J. Strang was so often brought up before tribunals on just such charges that he said with the utmost stretch of memory he could not remember the number of times he was honorably acquitted. He was acquitted every time. Their enemies in both cases say that their brethren swore them out, swore alibis, swore everything truth and falsehood, and procured their acquittal in this way. James was hunted in his ministry as with bloodhounds, and a large reward offered for his head, dead or alive. As was Joseph Smith, and after years of unsuccessful effort to kill him by law, the good people, of whom Mr. Isaac Scott is an example, who knew so well that he was an impostor and deceiver, swore that as law would not reach him, powder and bullets would. And they did, precisely as they did in Joseph's case. You would scarcely think that there was such a likeness in the characters of the two, but it is really a fact. Joseph's case was called martyrdom and sealing his testimony with his blood, but the whole circumstances and causes were all so nearly alike in both cases we often wonder that even spurious Mormons do not see the parallel. Poor benighted Strangites can account for it only on the ground that the same cause produces the same effect. If the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? There is still another thing that puzzles, and I confess often makes me sad. That is that while Mormons are everywhere crying out to the Gentiles, that the great mass of mankind were always ready to honor and revere the memory of dead prophets. They always persecuted, shamefully slandered, and often martyred the living ones immediately sent among them. Yet Joseph Smith was hardly cold in his clay when the very Mormons began to do these very things themselves. And while they had for years condemned the practice among Gentiles of resorting to foul slander as the best means to put down Mormonism, instead of trying to do it by the word of God, those were the very means resorted to by themselves to prevent God Almighty from fulfilling his word through Joseph. Now, if there is any man anywhere today getting up another plausible and slick Spalding story to answer the end intended by its predecessor, but who is at a loss to account for the many or any of the wonders of Joseph's ministry, I would most earnestly recommend him to consult Mr. Isaac Scott and his confederates. If Scott especially can't furnish him with such means, he may as well consider his work a failure. Isaac has a most decided talent and turn for any business of that kind, I tell you. Would not some such theory by which he endeavors to account for the Vori plates be a good way to account for the plates that old Joe showed to the 8 witnesses? Precisely like any other sectarian who undertakes to attack Mormonism, Isaac does not seem to notice that while he is attacking Mr. Strang's claims and ministry, he is most effectively undermining or taking the underpinning from under his own faith. That is, if he has any. Supposing, for instance, that these 3 men, as Scott says, did really forge that letter of appointment, we find in that letter some very remarkable prophecies, quite as much so as any ever uttered. So we've got Isaac also attacking the letter of appointment. Quite as much so as any ever uttered by Joseph Smith or anybody else. So the question naturally arises, if this trio of speculating knaves and scamps, so-called, can foretell such remarkable things with such remarkable accuracy, with their peculiar inspiration, why couldn't Joseph Smith do the same? Or similar things with just such inspiration, that is, the low and groveling spirit of money-making by knavery and fraud. Just such a spirit as his enemies have all along accused him of possessing. One of these prophecies reads, "My servant Joseph, Thou hast been faithful over many things, and thy reward is glorious. The crown and the scepter are thine. Here we have the kingly reference again. And they wait thee, but thou hast sinned in some things, and thy punishment is very bitter. To those who have read the account of Joseph's death, no doubt, no further proof of the faithful fulfillment of this prediction is needed. And no one fact in relation to that letter is any clearer than that its contents were made public on the 9th day of July, 1844, the day claimed as the date of its reception. Joseph was indeed slain some 12 days before the alleged receipt of that letter. But in a day when there were no railroads from Nauvoo to Burlington, Wisconsin, it necessarily took a tedious time to get a letter a distance of some 400 miles. And whatever else may be said of that letter, it cannot be denied that its contents were made public in Burlington, Wisconsin, before any news of Joseph Smith's death arrived in that place. That's the thing. The letter, even though it was 12 days after the date of death of Joseph, it was mailed 9 days before that. And it arrived in Wisconsin before the newsstands carried the news of Joseph's death. So you can imagine what people were thinking when James said, I have been ordained by an angel to lead the church in Joseph Smith's stead. They're like, yeah, but Joseph's leading that church. And then later on, he gets a letter of appointment from Joseph Smith that says, if anything happens to me, you will lead the flock. And then they get the news that Joseph was already dead. Okay? Another prophecy, and now remember that Scott says that Strang dictated every word of that letter of appointment. So this is the claim of Scott, that Strang dictated every word in the letter of appointment. We know that's not true because it was mailed from Nauvoo, 400 miles away, and Strang himself is traveling by foot, being impoverished. I'm sure he doesn't have the money or the influence to get somebody to walk 800 miles or take a carriage that he can't afford to go mail this letter. But that's beside the point. He's still got to know the future in order to make this plan work. And he's got to get Emma Smith to corroborate the writing of the letter, which she did. Great calamities are coming on the church, and such as have not been. This is in the letter. Is there a believer in Mormonism today endowed with a reasonable share of common sense who is prepared to dispute the fulfillment of this prediction? There is not a Mormon on earth that can successfully do it. And in point of veracity and extent of complications, it is fully equal to anything foretold by Joseph Smith at any time in his ministry. First of all, it was a very sad calamity that Joseph and Hiram should be slain. Second, it was the saddest of all calamities that Brigham Young should have gotten the lead over a portion of the church, and they be thus led to destruction. Third, the rejection of this church at Nauvoo with their dead, as promised in the Doctrine and Covenants if they were removed, after all their sacrifice and toil, was an exceedingly sad and sore calamity. Fourth, the loss of the temple, costing in the neighborhood of $1 million, was a most sad calamity. Fifth, the loss of at least 2,000 people by want, exposure, and destitution was a terrible, sad, and great calamity. Sixth, the demand made upon them of 500 of their best men to fight in Mexico at the war from Brigham Young's troops at a time when, of all times, their services were most needed in their own ranks, was no very small calamity. Seventh, the immense sacrifice of property of all kinds accumulated in Nauvoo and other settlements. Eighth, the million sacrifices in transporting the people across the Rocky Mountains, and the millions expended and constantly necessary to keep up an irrigation system to produce the necessities of life in a salt and barren land, all of which might easily have been avoided and applied to the spreading of the gospel, are also among the greatest and most unusual calamities. Tenth, the Edmunds Law, since its operation, must have taken considerably over $1 million in money and value out of them in fines and confiscations. All these are great calamities, and such as the church theretofore had not experienced, but the end is not yet. Add to these things the darkness, the disorder, the scattering, the doubt, the confusion, and the indifference that have come over many thousands, and at the very least the hundreds of thousands who would have been in the church today but who are not, all of which are clearly traceable to the usurpations of Brigham Young and his followers. And we have a series of great and most unusual calamities, calamities which no living Mormon can contemplate without being driven to sadness and almost to despair, for the final success and triumph of this dispensation. And I tell you plainly that if it were not for the precious promises made in these our own days, both through Joseph and James, of the final triumph of this dispensation and the casting down of all usurpers by one mighty and strong as Moses, whom God is to send, I would have been driven to hopeless despair long ago. You may, gentlemen of the reorganized church and of the Brighamite party, hold up the revelation on the rebellion of South Carolina and the war that followed as indisputable evidence of the inspiration of Joseph Smith. And indeed it is. But what say you to the above prediction? As the slanderers of Joseph Smith have made Solomon Spaulding, according to their view of things, the ablest man that has ever stood upon the earth since the days of Adam, are you prepared to make James J. Strang a very similar person by attributing this and many other predictions to mere human wisdom? And if so, how will you get rid of the conclusion that Joseph Smith and all of the prophets uttered all their prophecies by mere human wisdom, and that the only keys they held were the greed of gain and money-making? Let us look at another prophecy of this letter. Quote, "The faith which thou, James, has in the shepherd and stone of Israel hath been repaid to thee 1,000-fold, and thou shalt be like him." As it has taken many old Mormons long and many years to learn that Joseph Smith was the modern shepherd and stone of Israel, how did it happen that James J. Strang, who had not yet seen a copy of the Doctrine and Covenants, a mere child in Mormonism, a babe in the faith, found that out? How did he find out? By the knavery which Mr. Scott attributes to him, that Joseph was the shepherd and stone of these latter days, and thou shalt be like him. Ah, that implies a great deal more than the letter of appointment and a mere claim to angelic ordination. How could Mr. Strang or anyone else be like Joseph as a prophet unless he should not only claim an appointment by revelation, an angelic ordination to the highest order of the Melchizedek priesthood, but in entering also upon just such a work as Joseph had merely begun? That is, the bringing forth and the translation of ancient and sacred records by the gift and power of God, by Urim and Thummim, as well as the giving of other revelations for the guidance of his ministers and the regulation of the church, just as Joseph did, teaching the same order of the two priesthoods and the same duties of members and officers and quorums, the same baptism for the dead, with its most solemn teachings and necessity, the same temple building, tithing, baptism, confirmation, blessing of infants, giving line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little, in proportion as needed and required, and as the capacity of the people demanded. And as the same causes produces like effects, how should James or anyone else be like Joseph unless he should be hounded and slandered and defamed to the lowest hell by the fallen and corrupt Mormons, and thereby be arraigned before courts and tribunals upon the charges of all kinds of crime, and honorably acquitted every time, and then finally be martyred as Joseph was? And did not all these things happen to him as they happened to Joseph? And in which of these things was he lacking? As Joseph's works fitted into and harmonized with the former prophets, so James' works and Joseph's works run together and harmonize like water from a crystal fountain, or the timbers of a vast building fitly framed by two master workmen. Test the one as you test the other. And when you find one of James' timbers too large or too small in tenons and mortise to fit into Joseph's framing, cry out against him. When I say test them, I don't mean to test their mere conversation. The 1,001 he told me's, and I heard him say's, that are liable in being bandied about from mouth to mouth to be altered and changed in meaning and form. I mean test their written revelations and their written testimonies concerning them, and see if they will not agree one with the other. In fine, could he be like Joseph unless his whole prophetic life and ministry had been counted one continued round of fraud and crime to make money, just as it was with Joseph himself? John E. Page once asked, he was one of the apostles under Joseph Smith and James Strang, at a time when, if he ever was in his right mind, it was then, he said, in heaven's name, if Mr. Strang was not appointed by revelation through Joseph according to that letter and according to the law of God that's recorded in Doctrine and Covenants, who did Joseph appoint? That question is still unanswered, though it is so abundantly evident from God's law laid down through Joseph that God would appoint one by revelation through him to succeed him. John E. went on to state that if there was no revelation given through Joseph to appoint one in his stead, that Joseph had then proved himself a false prophet, and Mormonism had fallen to the ground. Anyone who will thoroughly look at the following passages must know that Joseph Smith merely opened this dispensation, and that there is a vast amount to come forth in this dispensation in the shape of records and to be translated into our language. Joseph says, quote, "For it is necessary, in the ushering in of the dispensation of the fullness of times, which dispensation is now, 1842, beginning to usher in, that a whole and complete and perfect union and welding together of dispensations and keys and powers and glories should take place and be revealed from the days of Adam even to the present time. And not only this, but that those things which never have been revealed from the foundation of the world, but have been kept hid from the wise and prudent, shall be revealed unto babes and sucklings in this, the dispensation of the fullness of times." See his second letter on baptism for the dead, paragraph 18. "Wherefore the things of all nations shall be made known, and there is nothing which is sealed upon the earth, save it shall be loosed. Wherefore all things which have been revealed unto the children of mankind shall at that day, this present generation, be revealed." See 2 Nephi 12, last paragraph. This would be one of the earlier editions. And he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heavens must receive until the times of the restitution or restoring of all things spoken of by the mouths of all the holy prophets since the world began. Acts 3:20-21. These most precious scriptures give us an idea of the vast that is come forth in this dispensation, which Joseph, a little before his death, has told us had only begun in his work. These things are called the oracles of God, or the sealed mysteries and revelations. Joseph held the keys of these mysteries. Quote, until I, God, shall appoint unto them, the church, another in his stead. Again, God says to him, quote, nevertheless, through you, by revelation, shall these oracles be given to another, even unto the church. Accordingly, James J. Strang was appointed by revelation from God through Joseph to stand in Joseph's stead to enter upon his work. And accordingly, he did enter upon and did bring many of these things to light. Accordingly to the faithfulness of the people. And now if James J. Strang had not done anything of this sort and was never appointed, then there is absolutely no evidence that anyone has been so appointed, for no one else has brought a line or a sentence of these precious things forth and has never even hinted at the matter. Nor has anyone ever presented a line of revelation through Joseph as an appointment to succeed him, which is the great key to this whole work. Therefore, says James, there is no escaping the conclusion that either I am a true prophet and his lawful successor, or Joseph is a fallen prophet and Mormonism an imposture. So we see from all these things that a vast there is to come forth in these days. And as they are all written upon material that cannot be corroded or dimmed or destroyed by time, there are yet many things to come forth on metallic plates that will need to be slandered and defamed by a high priest after the order of the son of perdition. And therefore Mr. Scott, or someone to take his lineal priesthood, cannot well be spared yet a while. We will now enter upon other ground. From a revelation given to James in 1849, January 7th, we quote the following. And now turn unto me, all ye my people, lest the disobedient and rebellious be cut off, and cast out of his possessions, and persecution and wrath come upon those who are slack in serving me. And I give you chastisement and much sorrow, for your enemies shall be upon you, and you shall flee before them, if you turn not unto me to be faithful. And that is exactly what happened in Beaver Island. Now, I am quite willing to leave this matter to those who have been driven from the islands, to say whether these things have been fulfilled upon them or not, whether they have remained true to God under James or turned away from him. Again, we quote from the same revelation, moreover, I have given you the islands of the great lakes for a possession. There shall ye dwell apart from the Gentiles, and none shall make you afraid, for my law shall be kept there, and judgment shall be rendered against those who despise it. If ye will, therefore, possess these things, remember my law to keep it. Forget not the precepts which I have given you, but act wisely according to the word of wisdom which I have given you. And despise not my word, for it is not a vain thing. I have given you wisdom with promise. if ye will not regard to live by it, the promise is not unto you. I noticed that the Isaac Scotts and the Chauncey Loomises and the host of other fair weather friends and Job's comforters, in their denunciation of things they understand not, have seemingly got it into their heads that if James J. Strang were only a prophet of God, the people under him must and ought to prosper greatly, whether they act wisely or foolishly, disobediently or obediently, whether tobacco juice is constantly oozing from their lips and streaming down their chins or not, whether their nerves are all unstrung by enervating and stimulating hot and injurious drinks or not, whether in midsummer pure hog's grease oozed from the pores of their skin or not, whether they had jarrings, bickerings, lawsuits or backbitings or complainings, or did not have them, no matter. They must prosper under a prophet of God anyway. They may tell us that James said this and that about their never being driven from there, but neither in the law brought forth by James, nor Joseph, nor by Moses, nor by any other prophet since the world began can they find any such promise, not one. It is plainly written in both the law of God and the revelations of James that our remaining on the islands or anywhere else where the saints are called is on condition of obedience and is not assured on any other ground. Your vineyards, your gardens, and your orchards ye shall plant again, and they shall flourish. This is another quote. And ye shall eat the fruit thereof. Ye shall build houses, and shall inhabit them, and children's children shall be in them, for a crown of glory to you, if ye remember the Lord your God, whose name is great and glorious, and keep his statutes. And again, in another place we read that we shall read the law in the voice of mourning when we have sinned against God and have fled before our enemies. See the book of the law, page 206, paragraph 12. Ye shall therefore read it in all the days of your lives, the law. Ye shall read it in your solemn assemblies and in your joyous meetings with the shout of triumph when your enemies flee before you, and in the voice of mourning when you have sinned against God and have fled before them. Ye shall read it in the gathering of your neighbors and in the household with your children. It says, and also 207, paragraph 17. So if you want to look that up, look that up. Those who kept the commandments of God and his law and the word of wisdom and tried to have others do so are witnesses that prosperity, peace, and prevailing against the enemy were realized, and that for years they enjoyed those blessings and promises on the islands. But they noticed also that in the last year of their dwelling there, backbiting, bickering, lawsuits, jealousies, jarrings, and want of devotion and prayer in families began to steal in among them. And in proportion as these things gained ground, the enemy began to steal in and gain ground also. Precisely as it has been in Missouri and in many other places where there has been a gathering of saints in times of old, as in these days. The Book of Mormon has many such examples of this kind written in it for our learning. So it has been, and so it will be in the gathering places of the saints. There must be righteous here, or there is no assurance of permanent residency or prosperity there. That is all. And even at the final ingathering of all the saints, no more to be thrown down, God says, nevertheless, if they pollute their inheritance, they shall even then be thrown down. For I will not spare them if they pollute their inheritances. These things are a full answer to the question, why is Vori left desolate, and Nauvoo and Kirtland and Independence and all other places where saints were called? We are Latter-day Israel, and God has dealt with us as he dealt with former day Israel. No difference. And though the Shimmies and the Scotts and the Loomises cast stones at and curse us, let them beware what they are doing. For these places will all be built up, and every promise that God has made in relation to them will all be fulfilled. And those who have reviled the prophet James and the work he has done will be brought to shame and the contempt of mankind. For let me tell them that there is any amount more in Strangism so-called than its revilers and persecutors have ever thought of. And in a day when they least expect it, this truth will burst upon them with a glory that will cause dismay in their ranks. It seems the lessons of the past are written to them to no very great profit. We quote once more from the above revelation and will let that for the present suffice. They that speak evil of him, James, are enemies unto me, saith the Lord. They have given themselves unto lies, and their hearts to wickedness. For he is meeker than Moses and more patient than Job. Who can resist the truth contained here? Now take that class of men who have distinguished themselves most in defaming Mr. Strang and the works he has done, and just look over their careers. And where do we find them? Take the Brighamite leaders to begin with, who have first of all spoken evil of Mr. Strang and cut him off from the church without a hearing. If they have not gotten up a refuge of lies and wickedness to sustain themselves in power and to lead the church, then we boldly assert that a refuge of lies for that purpose has never been invented since the world began. In this refuge, the 12 literally abolished two of the most important quorums of officers in the church as Joseph left it. For in putting themselves at the head, they not only put the 12 heads, all of which were of equal power, one with the other, over the church, but in doing so they abolished their own quorum and that of the first presidency also, which was the most important quorum in the whole church. Taking their own word for it, they thus put 12 prophets, seers, revelators, and translators over the whole church, all of equal power, with power, gifts, keys, and priesthood, where God designed but one and made no provision in his law, only for one. We need only say that all the arguments, efforts, and craft used to accomplish this were all simply the basest of lies and wickedness. It was never done only on the grossest perversions and falsifications of God's law. Now take William E. McClellan, Aaron Smith, Johnny Page, John Gaylord, William Smith, Josiah Ells, William Marks, James Blakely, Charles B. Thompson, Isaac Scott, and others, all of whom have distinguished themselves as defamers of James J. Strang. And where does history find them? Great heavens, what a history. Simply a constant running out of one diabolical delusion into another all the way. Brewsterism, Benemiism, McClellanism, Brighamism, William Smithism, David Whitmerism, and even spiritualism. If the spreading of darkness and doubt and uncertainty among saints is the delight of Satan and his host, his works and doings of this class of men must have afforded him and all of his a real feast. The amount of evil they have accomplished against God and against man is not in the power of man to estimate, and will never be fully known in this life. If all these have not given themselves to lies and their hearts to wickedness, where in heaven's name will you find an example? O ye rebels, ye slanderers, ye defamers of God's anointed, is it any wonder that Vori and the islands of the Great Lakes are desolate? Is it any wonder that all the gathering places of Zion are a desolation, and the inhabitants thereof sighing, and strangers and wanderers among the nations? Is it any wonder that God has hidden his face and covered or hidden the seers and the prophets? For it is written, when the wicked rise, a man that is a man of God is hidden. How true it is that these men have only accomplished to scatter, and their evil ways follow them. And they remember any prophecy that James J. Strang ever uttered has been fulfilled. Whose fault is it if they do not? There are a great many good things which they don't see. Proof positive that there is no light abiding in them. Yes. Well, the people most invested in disproving James J. Strang would be the Brighamites. Now, about these plates that Fair says are forgeries, I was speaking to one woman. She wasn't a Mormon. She was a Christian, and she said, well, where are these plates today? And the Vori plates, many people held them. James would carry them around. He would let people handle them. Anybody could see them that wanted to. Anybody who thought they knew anything about metallurgy or what have you was free to take a look at the plates. And he carried them around for years because the Vori plates were not as sacred as the plates of brass. He was able to show those to people. And when James died, the plates remained with his wife. And, they're not here anymore. And the woman said, well, that's convenient. I said, it depends on who you ask. The people that believe that the plates are genuine find it very inconvenient, and also nobody's fault on the Strangite side. For the plates remained with James' wife, and she carried the plates for a while, or kept the plates for a while, and gave them to a Strangite missionary. And that Strangite missionary took them to Utah, where I happen to be right now, 20 miles from Salt Lake City. Just so happens. And he wanted to show them to the Brighamites here and convert them. And so he brought the plates, he showed them to people, and they turned up missing from his house, which is no surprise among the Brighamites. The same happened to William Smith. He was cornered. They took all of his books away from him. That is how they got The History of Joseph Smith by his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, and published it. They ended up publishing more than one edition because Brigham went and redacted that book. And it's a very interesting book to compare all the editions, especially the part where it addresses Samuel Smith's death. And just so happens to have inserted a line in Brigham's edition that wasn't in Mother Smith's edition, where he comes back from running from the mobs on the day of his brother's assassinations and proclaims, "I don't know that I might have sustained a mortal wound," and happens to die 30 days or so later of a mysterious fever. Most unusual. And if you had happened to have something to do with such a fever, it would be convenient to try to throw a red herring out there or something to deflect any accusation and assign his death to be somehow affiliated with the martyrdoms of his two older brothers. So that is our analysis of the best that FAIRMORMON has to offer, which amounts to hearsay. It amounts to the same methods that they defend Joseph Smith against. It amounts to them exposing their hypocrisy, and it amounts to the solid case that James J. Strang was and is indeed the successor of Joseph Smith, a prophet of God with witnesses like Joseph who lived a parallel life to Joseph and who divinely translated the most important book of Scripture ever recorded. And it's still here for us today, along with James' Revelations. If you do not have a copy, you can email me at gnosticmormon@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook. My name is Alexei Matanovich. And you can follow me at the Gnostic Mormon YouTube channel. And you can also read my blog. We've got some very interesting material, and it's called the Strangite Herald. So it's blogger.com, and let's see, /Strangite Herald. No. Okay, well, it's just blogger.com, and what is it? Okay, view blog. Okay, it's just the Strangite Herald, the Strangite Herald, one word, .blogspot.com. That's what it is. And you can read about the apostasy of Brigham Young. You can read about the excommunication of Brigham Young. As Brother Wingfield Watson, who's gone to rest with his ancestors by now, a long time ago. He was a young man at the time that he was on Beaver Island with James Strang. But as he mentioned, and I haven't read yet, his argument that James fulfills the prophecy of the one mighty and strong, I want to compare it to my own, which I have published on the strangiteherald.blogspot.com. You can read, it's called One Mighty and Strang, that I wrote many years ago. And you will see that Strang not only completely fits the prophecy of the one mighty and strong, but is the only one that could fit that exact prophecy. Now, there is another prophecy of a one mighty and strong, so there's not just one, right? So don't get all upset if your favorite prophet you're convinced is the one mighty and strong, or if you happen to be a one mighty and strong. But the one mighty and strong that Joseph was talking about, at least immediately, was James Strang. And I explained that in that article, You can follow that up with the article called One Mighty Among Them, which shows that James Strang was also prophesied of in the text of the Book of Mormon itself. And it's the same prophecy as the One Mighty and Strong. So now I'm going to go read Brother Watson's analysis and compare it to my own. But that came many years ago by inspiration, so give that a read. You will also find the testimonies of the Smith family to Brother Strang and other articles as well that will be just as informative. Let's see, the family debates on the succession, Joseph Smith, his view on the Trek West, that's an interesting one. The testimonies of the Smith family, testifying to James Strang, Mother Smith says, he is verily the successor, and she tells Reuben Miller to hear his mother in Zion and take her word for it. And Mother Smith was also a prophet in her own right, and she recorded a revelation herself, which you can find in the book of Avar, the first chapter, and you can find that book at cjccf.org. And look under scriptures, and you can read that. You can download that for free there. You can also find it for a download or in print, I believe on lulu.com. Just look for the Church of Jesus Christ and Christian Fellowship and their selection of books. The book of Avar consists of all of the revelations of Joseph Smith, with the history from the Joseph Smith history with other relevant notes, letters, and historical documentation that fleshes out the story of all of the revelations leading up to the publication of the Book of Mormon. So it's a very good presentation for that work, and definitely check that out. But read Mother Smith's revelation, so she was prophetic in her own right, as well as Joseph's father, Joseph Smith Sr. So that wraps it up for today. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, send me comments and feedback, questions that you have that I didn't cover, because obviously I skipped over a ton of things. There were things that I could have gone into more detail about, and if you're interested in those, we can address those in another video. So yes, need to hear your feedback, your questions, comments. If I didn't convince you about something and I need to further back it up, or if you have a different piece of a viewpoint, or you have some evidence, right? Because evidence is key. All of the stuff about Joseph's polygamy, all of the stuff about James Strang and the fraudulent claims and everything, the bottom line, there's no evidence for any of it, and innocent until proven guilty. But I will listen to your evidence. Still waiting to hear it. It needs to be published, and you know what? The anti-Mormons and the anti-Strangites need to step up their game and really support what they're saying. And you know, if I happen to be wrong and deluded, you can help me out, because I would love to devote my time and my life energy to supporting causes that are, you know, intelligent, rational, good, and righteous, and you know, so that's where we're at. Shoot all that stuff to me, gnosticmormon@gmail.com, and you know, follow or comment on YouTube and Facebook, and or make your own video. You know, it's a really good way to talk back at me, is to make a video and post a link. Because you know, if you type a really long comment, you know, and especially if it's really ranty or hard to follow, you know, a video might do even better. Or you know, we can meet on a Zoom call and have a conversation. Anyway, God bless you in your spiritual pursuits, in your pursuit of truth, in your pursuit of history, in all of your endeavors. Be safe. Take care.